When you spend long enough surrounding yourself with and talking about video games, the discussion inevitably turns to what will end up killing them. You know, as soon as any one medium of entertainment starts to build up a head of steam, you get projections of how something else will replace it, or maybe playing video games for decades is actually heavy exposure to gamma radiation, or maybe just the business side of things gets a little too out of hand. I've seen a lot of blind trust from gamers over the years, and it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that this kind of faith is exploited for financial gain. Because some people are just dicks like that. I realise that not everyone knows what microtransactions are when talking about a video game, but they're effectively a means of expediting progress within that game at the cost of real-world money. It's not so bad if it's optional, but slowly over time we've seen developers and publishers make it a little more mandatory. And fuck that. It's at this point that, in pursuit of a fair and balanced argument, I feel the need to point out that from a cold business point of view, microtransactions are a great idea, but one that won't win you any friends. It's very hard to view them as anything other than a method through which a developer or publisher can squeeze a naive player dry and offer them empty rewards in return. In fact, their presence tends to devalue a game, as the game itself makes it much easier to achieve progress through opening your wallet than by doing the video gamey stuff, and how much more fun would I be having if I wasn't being nudged in the direction of paying real-world money all the time? Don't remind me of the real world. I'm trying my best to escape it at the moment. So in case it wasn't incredibly obvious, there's going to be a lot of cynicism and criticism throughout this video because, breaking news, microtransactions are kind of shitty. But I think the best way to start it all off is by recounting a cautionary tale that shows just what kind of effect microtransactions can have on the game, the fans, and how both are perceived by the wider world. Though I would say that whatever your stance on microtransactions, you should probably stick by it. If you declare that your video game will never have microtransactions, that seems like the kind of promise you might want to keep. Especially since Payday 2 is a co-op shooter rather than the kind of game that pits players against each other. Not like the latter is any kind of justification for all the crap that comes with microtransactions, but playing against AI brings up absolutely zero scenarios where a player would want to cough up some cash. And yet, just 2 years after declaring that they'd never go down this path, developer Overkill announced they'd be adding these safes that housed weapon skins, some of which had modified stats, that could only be opened through the purchase of some special drills with real-world currency. Understandably, and especially considering Overkill's original stance with Payday 2, fans bombarded the developers with wave after wave of criticism, with moderators for the Steam community going on strike until they were allowed contact with Payday 2's producer, Almir Listo. I can't say if the microtransactions had much of an impact with how the game was played, but their inclusion completely shifted the community's mood and sent the player base into a downward spiral until the safes and the drills were removed entirely in May of last year. This game is all about heists and stealing people's money, and that is a little too perfect, really. Try and keep the villains inside the video game. The part of this video's title that should stand out the most is the little bit about a game being ruined by microtransactions, and that does imply that the game was quite good until microtransactions got involved, but I think I can include games that were kind of bad that were made way worse by including microtransactions. Because that's what I'm going to do right now. Evolve was a doomed game right out of the gate, with pre-orders being available before anyone had seen any footage of it. Sometimes you get the sense that a game is being made to maximize profits and not to give the world some kind of memorable gaming experience that you'll keep coming back to day after day, and while I don't think that Evolve is unsalvageable as a video game because there are a few redeemable moments, overall it just isn't worth saving. So we'll move past the repetitive and somewhat boring gameplay and move right along to just how much shit Evolve tries to pawn off on you. The earliest pre-orders known to man were a bit excessive, but as soon as you boot up the game and take in how little content you've bought with your money, it soon becomes very obvious that Turtle Rock Studios expected you to shell out even more money to fill in the gaps. Some of the microtransactions can reach as high as $15 to add another monster to the roster, and while I think that most of this store acts more like traditional DLC, it's framed in such a way that the stuff you're buying is the kind of useless crap any other game would have put in a loot box. In a way, I'm pleased that Evolve is so upfront with what you're getting for your money, but on the other hand, this is all very lazy and very scummy. Most of the player base thought so too, as they all abandoned Evolve shortly after it came out, forcing Evolve to become free to play last year. They won't be making that mistake again. Mobile games operate on a whole different level when it comes to microtransactions. The target audience for the average mobile game is considerably more casual than with regular releases, so you're often looking at a free-to-play model with a heavy focus on microtransactions. It works well for a casual market because people don't have to invest any money in a game they might not even like. And if they do find themselves enjoying this free app, they can always bypass some of the inconveniences. I'm kind of okay with this model, but more and more these days we're seeing established video game franchises entering the mobile market and taking their brands into unknown territory. And I'm not sure I'm quite as comfortable with those franchises using microtransactions. Mostly they're handled responsibly and with no great emphasis on spending cash to get around bad game design, but then there's Final Fantasy. In theory, this is a wonderful idea. A more casual pick-up-and-put-down Final Fantasy game that you can play in short bursts while waiting for the bus or something, where the gameplay is suited for a more laid-back experience and where you can have a party made up of characters from the past and present. Basically, Fire Emblem Heroes, but with a different kind of turn-based combat. But no, while Heroes has a certain amount of restraint over asking you for money, Final Fantasy All the Bravest is kinda shameless. You're already spending money to download it, but what you get for it is a game devoid of tactics as you get your party of up to 30 characters to all bum rush the enemy by furiously poking the screen. You spend a bit of cash for the game to randomly unlock a hero for you, and if you're lucky it might just be a character you care about. But even worse, every time one of your party members dies, you have to wait 3 minutes to revive them, so you're looking at up to a 90-minute wait if you lose a battle. It's fine though, because you can always pay to revive them ahead of time, but for a full team wipe, it can get pretty pricey. I've heard reports of the game costing you over $50 if you're willing to do everything All the Bravest asks of you, and suddenly a mediocre AAA game sounds inviting. How do you even do that? I'm reasonably okay with AAA developers weaving microtransactions into one of their own games that doesn't need it, because at least that game can exist in a vacuum that I don't have to care about. Like, the new Need for Speed game has some pretty abhorrent microtransactions that literally take the form of a slot machine, just so the gambling parallels weren't blatantly obvious before. But also, I don't really care about this game, and I definitely don't care enough to spend any extra money on it. So I end up being caught between not caring and also caring quite a lot if anything like this ends up in a game I like. Let's face it though, Activision were never gonna handle the Call of Duty Modern Warfare remaster with any tact. What's worse than putting microtransactions in a game that doesn't need them? How about introducing these kind of features into a game that has previously found rampant success without needing to remind the player every 5 seconds that they could be spending even more money? I don't know, that seems like an easy way to announce to the world that you are far more interested in using a name to make some quick money, and I feel like that might not be in the spirit of what a remake or remaster should be. The Modern Warfare remaster was already being held to ransom by Activision on release day, since you couldn't play it without also buying Infinite Warfare, and no. But the inclusion of microtransactions in what is supposed to be the definitive version of my favorite game in the franchise is equal parts insulting and almost admirably audacious. Like, Activision thought this was an idea they could do, and have done. We're in trouble when reality starts to feel like a parody. Within the last year, we've seen a shift towards the normalization of microtransactions and how their presence in games isn't questioned, but actively encouraged to safeguard profits, and that is very concerning. These days, we see loot boxes in a game and we just accept that they're part of a package without first wondering if they need to be there in the first place. I'm a little desensitized to them myself since I've done my hours in Team Fortress 2 with the crates and the keys and the hats and the... There's a game under here somewhere, isn't there? It's kinda hard to find it. Given that every AAA game under the sun seems to be including loot boxes in some way to prolong its chances of making money, you naturally start looking for ground zero. I hear a lot of people blame Overwatch for including loot boxes and making that an okay thing to do, but when I think of a game that has really benefited from this model, you just can't look past Team Fortress 2. The most important distinction to make with TF2 over every other game on this list is that the microtransactions don't directly affect the game in any way. Valve have been adamant since the day TF2 went free to play that any additions that demand money from the player are cosmetic only. Even the weapons you can buy or just unlock through a number of other means are meant as side grades with benefits and drawbacks to the defaults. But over the years, and with the cosmetics and hats gradually becoming prevalent, with rarer varieties introduced to make opening these crates even more enticing, the economy of TF2 has shifted drastically. And not just the marketplace on Steam that earns Valve enough money that they don't need to make any more games. You can see that any updates for Team Fortress 2 are made with these highly profitable cosmetics pushed to the front. The more elusive variations of hats and weapon skins go for impossible amounts of money, and I honestly feel like this is a bad focus for any game to have. I've heard there's something similar in place with Counter-Strike, but I've put 2,000 hours into one of these games, and it might be the one that rhymes with cream tortoise shrew. Maybe they're just a test of how vain one person can be. I know why you're here, and I'm pretty sure you know why you're here. It's all fun and games when it's an annual first-person shooter or some sleazy mobile app that are whoring themselves out in a desperate attempt to separate you from your salary, but suddenly it becomes all too real when microtransactions are rife in a game that carries a name of great significance to many people. There was a point in history when we thought that EA had learned their lesson from 2015's Star Wars Battlefront and that they should probably finish a game if they wanted to charge full price for it, and especially if expensive DLC finishes the game for them. Hence why the DLC for Battlefront 2 was free? Still is free? Well, to tell you the truth, in all the excitement, I kind of lost track. There was bigger fish to fry, really. And hey, I actually got a chance to play some Battlefront 2 in August at Gamescom, and the space battles were pretty engaging. But everyone had the same gear, so you can see why you might get the illusion of Battlefront 2 being fair to everyone, and not requiring a fuckload of money being invested in microtransactions. Taking the pay-to-win to the logical extreme, Battlefront 2 quickly went from simply feeling like the best loot was hidden away behind a paywall, to actively barring access to famous Star Wars characters unless you can part with tens of thousands of in-game credits, earned over the course of a few days worth of play, or you could just throw lots of money at the problem and hope it goes away. I'm sure we all know the stories of how Belgium investigated Battlefront 2's loot boxes and found them to be a form of gambling, calling for them to be banned in Europe, or how EA have temporarily removed the microtransactions. It's funny how the word temporarily doesn't instill any kind of confidence that EA are doing anything other than save face and encourage people to buy it at launch, before then reintroducing microtransactions to a semi-active audience. They really want to bring back that worst company in America competition, don't they? Let's pick up on that loot boxes are gambling thread and use it to compare single-player and multiplayer games. Both types of gaming have ways of introducing a challenge to the player, with multiplayer games having more of a variance to them due to the different rates at which real people can get good at a game. Loot boxes are nefariously deployed as a means of getting ahead of the curve, or even forming the curve in the first place. You could spend hours honing your skills, but if you can pay money to unlock an item that regenerates your health faster, you can see the incentive. Single-player games are a whole different ballgame though, and honestly, even harder to justify. You can't really have loot boxes and microtransactions in a game like Middle-earth: Shadow of War without completely ruining the pacing and the challenge. Importantly, even if they are optional, the spectre of microtransactions hangs over Shadow of War like a vicious predator lurking in the background, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Shadow of War specifically is a little hard to follow with exactly how the loot boxes work within the game's framework, but it seems like you can unbox orcs of variable quality to add to your army. But hang on, you can recruit enemies without the need to pay anything, and you even get to go through the entertaining process of capturing an orc with the Nemesis system, which in turn gives the enemy its own personality and a potential story arc of redemption and self-sacrifice. The loot boxes cheapen this by a huge amount, but they're only in the game to provide an easy out if frustration gets the better of you and you want a fast solution. At some point I start assuming that difficulty spikes are deliberately designed to encourage me to buy loot boxes, and that feels very deceptive. Never mind that microtransactions in a single player game are only there to expedite your journey to the end, something made painfully obvious if you want the bonus ending in Shadow of War because it's either loot boxes or an arseload of grinding. I know developing AAA games is expensive these days, but at least be honest with yourselves. Microtransactions suffer from a moral standpoint if you've got them something you can directly compare it to. AAA games in general are shown up by what Nintendo have been doing this year with Mario and Zelda, with neither game actively asking you for money to speed things up. Recharging the Master Sword would definitely have cost money if Nintendo hadn't have made this game. But also, sequels that suddenly introduce microtransactions look like shit in comparison to the original. I remember how much fun I had with the first Plants vs. Zombies. But we can't have that now, can we? Shit, I remember being excited for this game. I just finished the first game and found out the sequel was a few months away, so I had every reason to be hopeful. EA had taken a back seat for Plants vs. Zombies 1 and let PopCap Games do most of the work, but there was a definite shift of control for the sequel. For a start, Plants vs. Zombies 2 went free to play, which is potentially a bad sign depending on what happens next, but then stories started circulating of premium currency, i.e. real money, being required to purchase certain plants or upgrades, stuff that was readily available in the first game. The tipping point for me was having to spend money to replace the lawnmowers. In the original, these acted as a last resort for if a zombie reaches your house and will mow down all zombies in that lane. But you only get one per lane per battle until you restart the level. Nope, you have to pay to replace those now. How kind. I was curious to see what the general consensus was with Plants vs. Zombies 2 and if these manipulative features had affected anyone else. But it currently holds a 4.8 out of 5 on the iOS App Store, and this is why EA can do what they want, why they feel they can get away with it. EA can put whatever kind of crap they want in a game and we eat it up. We can't keep doing this. I think it's fair to say that microtransactions are very good at pulling you out of a game. That wasn't just a throwaway comment at the beginning. Every time I see a game mention that I can use real money to do a thing, I'm reminded that I'm in fact playing a video game that someone has made to make money. And I'm fine with that, but I just wish it wasn't so obvious. Like, putting microtransactions in a horror game would just be a little too on the nose for my liking. What is this subtle, and where can I get some? Calling Dead Space 3 a horror game is being exceptionally generous. The first one had the right idea, but over the course of the trilogy, the games have gotten louder and more stupid as EA realised that they've got something here that can make money for them, but could make even more if they took away the alienating horror elements and replaced them with even more action. But why stop there? Why not allow the player to microtransact some better weapons in Dead Space 3, slicing through any tension or resource management with one shitty design decision, and completing Dead Space's transition from atmospheric horror franchise to EA's latest cash cow. Maybe this was a precaution taken to ensure that EA and Visceral Games made some money back on the off chance that a game riddled with microtransactions and undercooked action set pieces didn't sell that well, and hot damned, how did they know? A month ago, EA shut down Visceral Games and effectively killed off Dead Space as a franchise. How much the failure of Dead Space 3 had to say in that matter is a mystery, but it feels like a terrible note to go out on. Turns out that following trends might be a bad idea after all. Who knew? Just how many times have I mentioned EA in some capacity in this video? I'll tell you because I feel like it's good to have some evidence before claiming that one company or another are leading the industry in dishonest bullshit. Somehow I've avoided filling the entire list with EA games, if just because I wanted some variety. But 4 out of the 10 games I've mentioned involve Electronic Arts in some way, including the top 3. Not just because of the stigma surrounding the company, but EA have found numerous ways of bringing excessive baggage to the table every time they use microtransactions. Kinda makes you feel nostalgic for a time when we didn't have to worry about this kind of stuff. Wait, nostalgia? That sounds like something we can exploit for monetary gain! To the EA mobile! The last Dungeon Keeper game was in 1999 and let you fulfill the fantasy that everyone has of becoming a maniacal overlord hell-bent on world domination through any means necessary. EA were a little less corporate-minded in 1999, but it's hard not to see Dungeon Keeper as an allegory of what EA have become many years later. You make a bunch of dungeons in this game so you can conquer the land and mainly each individual level in turn. Something about the camera angle or puzzle strategy style of gameplay makes Dungeon Keeper a great candidate for a casual mobile game. To be fair to them, EA had the same idea. They had other ideas as well. Mostly to turn a well-respected franchise that hadn't seen a new game for 15 years into an unplayable, pay-to-get-anything-done boil on the face of gaming that abuses the nostalgia held by longtime fans of Dungeon Keeper to put enough obstacles in their way that the idea of pumping money into this game sounds like a wonderful idea. Free-to-play games often use these artificial game lengtheners as a substitute for the entry fee you didn't pay when you downloaded the app for free. But Dungeon Keeper Mobile goes out of its way to make every action take longer so that paying money is the only viable way to play it. It soon becomes obvious that EA had no intention of making a new Dungeon Keeper game, and instead needed a new IP to experiment on in the off chance they struck it big on the mobile market. Instead, it runs so strongly against what video games stand for that I genuinely fear that this is the dystopian future we might be headed for. Seems like someone took Dungeon Keeper just a little too seriously. Are we all in EA's dungeon? I fear we might be. This has been RabbidLuigi, and I don't want this video to sound too preachy because I believe that you are entitled to your own opinion on microtransactions, but I personally believe that I would be betraying everything that I feel a video game should be if I didn't say that Dungeon Keeper Mobile is a game absolutely annihilated by microtransactions. But if you want a positive to take away from this video, the first two Dungeon Keeper games are great. I checked earlier and you can buy them for less than 500 crystals. Sounds like best value to me.